Early spring wind swept through the dust-lined streets of Gailsburg, carrying the dry scent of earth and the wooden clatter from a wagon that had just halted at the station. Nadira Holt stepped onto western soil with a breath that stumbled halfway. 3 weeks of travel through dust and cold suppers had passed, all because of the blue ink letter she held tight. 12 letters meant 12 promises. A home, a beginning, a man waiting at the end of the trail. Matthew Holt. Nadira adjusted the hem of her deep blue dress, worn thin after the long road. She searched the station yard, hope and nerves rising together. Matthew had written that he was tall, honey-haired, gentle-eyed, the kind who listened. She had pictured the moment of meeting him 100 times, yet no face in the crowd matched the man she expected. Nadira Holt? The voice behind her was low and weighty. When she turned, she nearly dropped her leather bag. The man standing there was not Matthew, but he carried something of him. The firm jawline, the straight nose, a look that marked him as a Holt. But his eyes were different, darker, deeper, shadowed by something heavy. "I'm Boone Holt," he said, holding his hat as if unsure where to place his own grief. "Matthew's younger brother." For a moment, Nadira heard no wind, no horses, no footsteps, only the tight pull of her own heartbeat, warning her of what she feared. "Matthew isn't here to meet me?" The question left her like a thin, trembling thread. Boone drew a breath, his dark eyes locking with hers for a moment too long. "Matthew is gone." His voice did not match his rugged frame. It was quiet, almost roughened by sorrow. 3 weeks ago, a riding accident while checking the north fence. The words struck the ground like a stone, pulling everything inside her down with it. She stood still, fingers whitening around the bag strap. She had imagined herself stepping into a new life, a warm table, a shelf of books, a gentle man's smile. Now, it scattered like mist. Boone lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. "He was looking forward to meeting you. When your acceptance letter arrived, he didn't finish. Nadira fought to keep her voice steady, but it cracked the moment it rose. "I understand." Boone swallowed hard before speaking again. "I arranged a room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. If you choose, I can put you on a coach back to Boston in a few days." Boston. A word that once meant home now felt hollow. Her parents were gone. The school in Boston had dismissed her because they would not allow a black woman to teach. She had left because there was no place for her. What was there to return to? She shook her head slightly, eyes on her worn gloves. "I haven't decided," she said. "I don't have many places to go back to." Boone watched her longer than needed. His gaze held no pity, only quiet understanding. The kind born from loss. "We'll figure it out," he said, voice low and steady. "There's no need to rush." There was a plain kindness in the way he spoke. No pressure, no charity. Only a man trying to honor a promise his brother never to keep. When Boone reached for her small trunk, his hand brushed against hers. A brief touch. Barely a moment. Too fleeting to be intimate, yet enough to draw a tight ache in her chest. Nadira looked up. Boone met her eyes for a breath. No words were exchanged, but in his gaze there was a thin, steady light, like a candle in a room too dark. Something unnamed, not clear enough to be hope, yet not faint enough to disappear. It lingered long after they left the windswept station, walking toward the boarding house where Nadira's life would turn down a road she never expected. Mrs. Peterson's boarding house sat at the end of Gailsburg's Main Street, a two-story yellow wooden home with a porch stretched out like open arms welcoming a traveler. When Boone helped Nadira step down from the wagon, the scent of toasted bread and coffee drifted through the air, warmer than any place she had touched since Boston. Mrs. Peterson, a kind woman in her 50s, hands always busy but eyes always soft, met them at the steps. After hearing a few quiet words from Boone, she touched Nadira's arm gently, as if afraid grief might shatter her. "Come in, child. Rest a while," she said, her voice warm as a wool scarf. Nadira's room was simple but clean. A low wooden bed, a small table by the window, a faded cotton curtain. Not luxurious, but honest. Honest enough to make a person want to cry. As Nadira brushed her hair and changed out of her dust-worn dress, the soft scent of soap rose around her, grounding her again in who she had been before the long road and the news that had broken over her. She steadied herself with a deep breath. That evening, the long dining table was already full. Merchants, rail workers, a young family passing through. When Nadira stepped down the stairs, every gaze lifted toward her. The silence lasted only a beat. But it was enough. In Boston, she had grown used to wary looks aimed at a black woman teaching in a classroom. In the West, where land was wide and people fewer, the looks held a mix of curiosity and uncertainty, as if they had never seen anything quite like her. Mrs. Peterson broke the pause with the sound of ladling soup. "This is Miss Holt, from Boston. We're lucky to have her." Nods circled the table. Conversation resumed along with the clink of utensils and the soft scrape of bowls. Yet Nadira still felt a few glances drifting her way now and then. Not unkind, only unsure. When Boone entered moments later, the table quieted again. He took the seat across from her, keeping his eyes low, as though afraid to touch the grief both of them carried. They spoke little during the meal, but every word carried the weight of things unsaid. "Matthew planned to bring a teacher here," Boone said, his voice low. "He believed this land needed someone who could teach, someone who could give it hope." Nadira set her spoon down, her chest tightening. He had pictured a future, and she had been part of it, even if that picture would never be finished. Boone continued, still without looking directly at her. If you don't want to return to Boston, Gailsburg still needs a teacher. The town school has been short since winter." Before Nadira could answer, the town banker, Mr. Grayson, leaned forward from the end of the table. "You're a teacher?" he asked, his eyes bright with hope rather than suspicion. "We've been desperate for someone qualified. If you're willing, the town council can meet you tomorrow." Nadira nodded, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "Yes, I can come." Boone laid down his fork and finally looked at her. No one else noticed, but she felt it keenly. A look from a man who understood her life had veered off course the moment Matthew died, and who was now trying, in his own quiet way, to set her on steadier ground. When supper ended, Boone excused himself. Mrs. Peterson walked Nadira to the porch where he waited. The lamplight warmed their faces, settling the evening into a calm hush. "I'll come back tomorrow afternoon," Boone said. "If you'd like, I can take you to meet the council. Make things easier." Nadira nodded. "Thank you." As Boone turned to leave, the night wind swept in from the prairie, carrying the scent of wood smoke. Nadira stood at the window of the second floor, watching him walk away. the broad set of his shoulders, the steady stride of a man used to carrying burdens. She had expected to feel hollow, the way she had when she first heard of Matthew. But strangely, as Boone's figure faded into the town's dark edges, she did not feel as alone as she thought she would. Something small had stirred. Not hope, not yet, but a quiet spark that kept her from sinking into the sorrow of her first night in Gailsburg. Nadira accepted the part-time teaching offer the next morning, just as sunlight touched the wooden roofs of Gailsburg. The decision did not come from haste, but from a quiet sense within her, as if this land had opened a space where she could stand steady again. That afternoon, Boone brought the wagon to take her to Holt Ranch. The road out of town stretched between thin grass hills, red earth marking the wheels, prairie wind lifting trails of gold dust into the air. Nadira sat beside Boone, both hands holding her hat to keep the wind from taking it. "Is the ranch far?" she asked, her voice just above the wind. "About 15 miles, Boone said. "You'll get used to it. Folks out here learn to live with long roads." He said it lightly, yet every time the wagon jolted, Boone leaned a little her way, as if trying to shield her even when he couldn't. Nadira noticed these small movements, and small things often spoke louder than words. When the wagon climbed the last rise, Holt Ranch came into view, a wide stretch of land washed in the light of late afternoon. The main house of oak timbers stood firm in the center, with a broad porch, a barn behind it, the corral beyond, and far off the grazing fields running to the horizon. Nadira held her breath. The sight was both wild and peaceful, a place one might begin again, if courage allowed. Boone stopped in the yard. When he stepped down and offered his hand, Nadira placed hers into his without thinking. His hand was warm and rough, hers small and soft. The contrast made her pause, but Boone helped her down gently, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Still, when his hand left hers, a small, cool emptiness settled in its place. "Your cabin is behind the garden," Boone said, as if to break the silence. "Matthew built it last year, thinking a teacher would come sooner or later." Nadira followed him to the cabin. The small wooden house was simple, the roof plain but tidy. On the porch sat an old rocking chair and a few sparse potted plants. Boone opened the door and let her step in first. The inside felt unexpectedly warm. A neat bed, a writing table, a small stove, a bookshelf against the wall. On it were hardbound volumes, leather covers, math primers, readers, and several worn copies of Shakespeare. "Matthew ordered them from Chicago," Boone said behind her, his voice lower than usual. "He said, 'Wherever there are children, there must be words.'" Nadira brushed her hand along a book spine. The paper was coarse, the ink faint, yet everything held the warmth of a man who had cared for a future he would never see. "Matthew was a good man," she said softly. Boone nodded without speaking, his broad shoulders tightening just a little. By supper time, they returned to the main house. Mrs. Davis, the ranch cook, greeted Nadira with a gentle smile. Children from the Davis family and nearby ranches had gathered, chattering about Boston, snow, and things they knew only from pictures. Boone sat at the head of the table, speaking little, watching more. Yet Nadira felt his gaze cross her path now and then, brief, quick, but never accidental. During the meal, when she told the children about seeing the ocean for the first time in Boston, their laughter rang bright. Nadira laughed with them, a light, clear sound, like finding a small piece of herself she had lost along the way. Boone watched the scene for a long moment, not in a way that made her uneasy, but as someone witnessing warmth he had not expected on a day that began in loss. Nadira happened to look his way and caught the glance. They held each other's eyes for only a heartbeat, yet long enough for her to sense something shift, like a taut rope easing, pulling them both an inch closer. After supper, Nadira stepped onto the porch, breathing in the scent of wild grass and coal smoke. Children's laughter still drifted from the yard. Boone stood a few steps away, giving instructions to the overseer. The sunset lay across his back, his figure steady as the land itself. Nadira did not know why, but in a place as unfamiliar as Holt Ranch, among people who were not yet hers, she felt far less alone than she had expected. Nadira's first days on Holt Ranch passed quietly but steadily, as if this wide land were slowly opening its arms to draw her into its rhythm. Each morning, she taught the Davis and Hanson children in a small room Boone had converted from an old storage shed. Warm yellow light from the single window fell across the desks, making every lesson feel touched by the West itself. The children liked her almost at once. Sarah Davis, 10 years old, always sat closest, watching every letter Nadira wrote with the curiosity of a child tracing thread. William raised his hand before finishing his thoughts, and Nadira often had to stifle a laugh. The three Hanson children were younger and more restless, but their eyes shone whenever she told stories of Boston or explained why snow falls from the sky. Each afternoon, when Boone took her to town to teach at the main school, the town children looked at her with a mix of wonder and respect. Nadira did not sense the guarded distance she had felt in Boston. There were whispers and curious glances, but no true rejection. Gailsburg was too new, too unfinished, to hold tight to old prejudices. The road from town to the ranch stretched long each evening, past brown earth scattered with pale stones and a small creek moving under the hill's shadow. Nadira cherished those rides, not for the scenery, but for Boone's quiet. His silence was not the heavy kind. It was clear, open space, room enough for a person to breathe without bracing themselves. Their conversations came in small pieces, never long, but always meaningful. "What kind of light do you like?" Boone asked one evening as the sun dipped low. Nadira blinked, surprised by the question. "I like warm light," she said. "Cold light makes me feel misplaced." Boone nodded, as if tucking the detail somewhere. The next day, in the ranch classroom, Nadira noticed the old oil lamp had been replaced with a glass lamp giving off a soft golden wick. She did not ask, and Boone did not explain. Another afternoon, when she yawned from fatigue, Boone eased the reins and slowed the horse. "Too much wind dries the throat," he said. Nadira turned to him. "You notice things like that?" He shrugged, eyes on the road. "I notice more than you think." It was not flirtation, just truth, a truth that made her turn away to hide the sudden smile rising in her. As the weeks passed, Nadira realized one thing clearly. Boone rarely held anyone's gaze for long. Yet sometimes, when she wasn't looking, his eyes lingered on her longer than needed. Late in winter, snow began to fall, thin, soft flakes drifting as if testing the earth. Boone walked her back from the ranch school to her cabin. He stepped ahead, opened the door, then paused under the porch. "Snow's starting," Nadira said, catching a few flakes in her palm. "Yeah." Boone glanced up at the whitening sky. "Winter's early this year." When Nadira bent to brush snow from her coat, Boone stepped close and reached toward her shoulder. "Let me," he said quietly. His hand passed over her shoulder so lightly, it felt more like wind than touch. But the warmth of his palm traveled through the thick fabric, startling her into stillness. The moment was brief. Boone brushed away the last flakes and pulled his hand back quickly, almost embarrassed. "Sorry," he murmured. "It was collecting too much." Nadira said nothing, only nodded, though her heartbeat had shifted to a different rhythm. Boone stepped back, as if to restore distance. But his eyes did not retreat fast enough. They touched hers for a second, then darted away. An unplanned touch, an uncovered glance, a warmth that shouldn't have lingered. But it did. When Nadira returned to her cabin, she closed the door and rested against it. Outside, snow fell quietly, laying a pale layer over Holt Ranch. Inside her, something was falling too, light, uncertain, but undeniable. And when she lifted the curtain to look outside, Boone's figure still stood under the porch, as if he too were weighing something he wasn't ready to name. That morning, the western sky was not its usual blue. Heavy clouds hung low, as if holding something unspoken. When Nadira stepped into the main house kitchen for breakfast, Mrs. Davis stood by the window, her expression troubled. "There's a storm coming," she said, her voice dropping. "Miss Holt, don't go to town today. The East Creek will rise fast." Nadira looked toward Boone as he pulled on his coat near the door. He gave a single nod, confirming it. "Stay on the ranch," Boone said. "I'll check the barn roof. Wind like this can tear it loose." Minutes later, the wind began to whistle through the planks as if trying to rip them free. The sky thickened into a hard gray. Nadira stood on the porch, watching Boone carry a ladder and an armful of tools, moving with the steady familiarity of a man long acquainted with the West's harsh moods. A sheet of tin slammed against the roof with a sharp crack. Nadira flinched. Without thinking, she grabbed her heavy cloak and ran after Boone, her heart pounding more from worry than from cold. The storm hit so fast no one had time to arrange their thoughts. Wind struck her face, rain cut into her skin like needles. When she reached the barn, Boone was bracing a large plank that the wind had ripped free. His shoulders bowed against the force, boots sliding on the slick mud. "Nadira, get inside," Boone shouted, his voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "You don't have enough hands," she yelled back, gripping the opposite edge of the board. Boone swung around, startled, not with anger, but with disbelief that she had run out after him. "Careful," he said, lowering the board so she could hold it. Wind slammed against them, forcing both to crouch. Their shoulders touched, their breaths mixing with the storm, close enough for Nadira to hear Boone's breath catch as he pushed back against the force. In that moment, they were no longer ranch owner and school teacher. They were two people standing against the weather, refusing to let the other fall behind. Rain clung to Nadira's lashes, running down her face, but she held firm, feeling Boone's strength meeting hers through the board. "Hold!" Boone barked, just as the ranch hands arrived with nails and a hammer. When the last plank was secured, both were exhausted. Nadira sagged against a horse's flank, breath uneven. Boone knelt beside her. "You're freezing," he said, his breath warm in the cold air between them. They took shelter in the barn. Inside, the dimness was calmer, only the hammering rain above and the uneven breaths of two people still catching themselves. Boone knelt in front of her. Without a word, he reached through her cloak and found her wrist. "Nadira," he said softly, voice so low she had to lean in to hear. Your wrist is ice cold. His fingers closed around her wrist, lingering longer than necessary. Warmth spread from his hand into her skin. Slow, steady, so much that Nadira didn't dare meet his eyes at first. But when she looked up, Boone was already watching her, not looking away this time. A gaze filled with worry, and something she did not dare name. The moment stretched, long, longer than any touch before it. A sudden gust slammed against the barn wall, startling them apart, eyes breaking, but something in their chests refusing to move on. We should get back to the main house, Boone said, as if reminding himself to draw distance again. Yes, Nadira answered. But when she stood, she realized her wrist was still warm from where he had held it. Supper that night was simple. Hot soup, bread, the fire snapping in the stove. But Nadira barely tasted anything. Her body still remembered the cold of the storm and the heat on her wrist. Boone sat at the head of the table, silent as always. Yet each time Nadira lifted her spoon, she felt his gaze resting on her for one quiet beat before slipping away. With the rain still pounding outside, Nadira returned to her cabin. She closed the door and leaned against it, her hands lifting instinctively to her left wrist, where Boone's touch still burned like a small ember, an ember quiet, but alive. Night wind swept across the grasslands of Holt Ranch, carrying the last damp breath of yesterday's storm. When Nadira knocked lightly on the small workroom beside Matthew's old bedroom, Boone was sitting at a wooden desk, lamplight forming a soft halo across his face. Before him lay an old leather journal, its pages worn thin as if turned 100 times. I found this in Matthew's trunk, Boone said, flipping a page. His journal. I thought, you should see it. Nadira stepped closer. She didn't sit right away. She stood behind Boone, looking down at the neat, gentle handwriting. Among notes about planting seasons and the horse herd was a page marked with a thin blue thread. Boone turned to it. He drew a design for a school, Boone said quietly. Somewhere between town and the ranches, so the children wouldn't have to walk so far. Nadira bent lower to see the pencil lines clearly. A schoolhouse with wide windows, a small bell tower, even a garden plot in the back. The space between them closed without intention, close enough that Nadira could hear Boone's breath beneath the wind outside the porch. Matthew dreamed far ahead, Nadira whispered. He thought for others more than I knew. Boone nodded slightly. Matthew always saw something good waiting in the future, even when the present wasn't easy. Nadira glanced sideways. Boone still looked at the page, but his eyes carried a weight, pain that had not healed. Boone, she asked softly, reading his journal like this, does it hurt you? Boone was silent for a long moment before answering, slow and steady. It does, but letting it fade would hurt more. She sat beside him. The distance between them was so small their hands would touch with the slightest movement. In the quiet, Boone turned a page. Matthew had written about hoping to find a kind teacher who could help the Holt children grow stronger than his and Boone's generation. Nadira, Boone said, his voice roughening, he chose the right person. Nadira turned. Boone's eyes were close enough that she saw her reflection in them. Then he spoke, as if he could no longer hold the words back. I'm trying to honor him, but I can't ignore what I feel for you. The small room fell still. The lamplight flickered, casting their joined shadows across the wooden wall. Nadira did not answer immediately. She simply looked at Boone. The man who kept distance, carried duty first, and tried to avoid the feeling growing too fast between them. Something softened inside her. Without hesitating this time, she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest. Her palm rested over the steady beat of his heart. So strong, she felt it through his shirt. Boone's breath caught. He didn't take her hand. He let it stay, as if thankful for the courage in her touch. Nadira. He murmured her name, his voice turning into something gentler than she had ever heard from him. She didn't pull away. In that moment, they were no longer separated by Matthew's memory. The grief no longer stood between them. It became a bridge, an understanding of loss, and the bravery needed to begin again. Boone lifted his hand slowly, as if afraid she might change her mind. His fingers brushed her cheek, then traced the line of her jaw. Nadira leaned toward the touch, small, real, quiet enough to guide both their heartbeats. No more words followed. They simply moved closer. Not a full step, just half a step. But it was the step that mattered. When their lips met, the kiss was not hurried. It was not a rush of desire. It was a whisper between two weary souls who had been alone too long and finally found someone steady to lean on. That night, in Matthew's small room, they shared a tenderness that carried no blaze but glowed like winter fire. Warm, calm, made of trust and gratitude that they had not missed each other. Nadira woke before dawn. The prairie's early air slipped through the door's cracks, cold, clean. Boone lay beside her, his arm firm around her waist, as if shielding her from the world. Outside, the sky was quiet, as though the storm had never come. Inside, her heart was steady, as though loneliness had never belonged there at all. Dawn light slipped through the window of Matthew's cabin, laying a thin, quiet glow across the wooden floor. Nadira woke first. What she felt was not the confusion people often speak of, but the warmth holding her, steady and sure as the land of Holt Ranch itself. Boone was still asleep. The sternness he usually carried had eased, leaving something softer, more vulnerable. When Nadira shifted slightly, Boone stirred too, his dark eyes opening and going straight to her, as if checking that everything was truly all right. "Good morning," Nadira said, her voice small but steady. Boone didn't answer at once. He looked at her a long moment, as if anchoring everything that had happened between them, then whispered, "Good morning." A long silence rested between them. Not awkward, but the silence of two people who know they have crossed into new ground and fear breaking the moment with words. Then Boone sat up. Morning light fell across the lines of his shoulders, and in that instant, Nadira saw the worry in him more clearly than anything he could say. It surfaced quickly. "Nadira," Boone began, his hand curling into a fist. "Last night, Nadira placed her hand over his, stopping him. "You don't have to apologize." Boone closed his eyes briefly, as if her words loosened something inside him. But he shook his head. "I just don't want anyone saying I stole Matthew's wife." Nadira was quiet for a moment. She didn't avoid the thought. She had faced it herself. But she had learned how easily people mistake things when they only see from one side. She turned fully to him. "Boone, Matthew is a past I never had the chance to touch," she said slowly. "What I had with him existed on paper. Beautiful, but not real." Boone opened his eyes, looking straight at her. Nadira continued, "What I have with you belongs to today. To what you do, how you look at me, how you remember every small thing. I love what's real, Boone. His throat tightened. It was the first time Nadira used the word love, not in the grand sense of vows, but in the honest sense. She loved what was real in him, loved the present, loved the now. Boone leaned closer, unable to hide the emotion crossing his face. But people out there, he said quietly. People out there don't live our lives, Nadira replied. But I understand. We need time. Boone exhaled for the first time that morning. So, we agree to keep this quiet for a while? Nadira nodded. So everyone can get used to me being here. So no one says I didn't take time to mourn Matthew. And so you don't carry blame you don't deserve. Boone gave a faint smile. A rare smile. Small but warm enough to settle into Nadira's bones. Thank you, he said. I don't know if I deserve this. Nadira lifted her hand and touched his jawline. The gesture small but true. You deserve it because you're kind, she said. Not because you're Matthew's brother. Boone leaned toward her, almost kissing her, then stopped, aware that morning light was clearer than night. Nadira laughed softly and touched her forehead to his, leaving only a breath between them. At breakfast in the main house, only the sounds of utensils and the crackling stove filled the room. No one noticed, but the warmth between Nadira and Boone was clear enough to heat the wooden table. Boone pulled out a chair for her, his hand brushing her back for a heartbeat. Nadira tilted her shoulder away, just enough to hide her smile. When Mrs. Davis asked if Nadira wanted more bread, Boone stood before she could answer, bringing her favorite piece from the kitchen tray. A small gesture, but their eyes met across the table. Brief, and enough to remind them both of the night before. That afternoon, after everyone scattered to their chores, Nadira came into the kitchen looking for coffee. Boone stood by the back doorway, gazing out over the fields, sunlight touching the bridge of his nose and the quiet depth of his eyes. She didn't expect him to turn, but he did. The room seemed to still. Boone stepped toward her, only one step. He took her hand, not pulling, not claiming, but asking. His hand was warm. Hers trembled slightly. Nadira did not pull away. We'll go slow, Boone said. But let me hold your hand when no one's looking. Can I? Nadira nodded. Yes. Their hands laced together in the doorway, where the afternoon light poured in, witnessing something fragile but undeniably real. A new month arrived with warm western wind. Holt Ranch and the town of Gailsburg were livelier than usual. Everyone knew they were about to raise something important. The school Matthew had once dreamed of. A place not only for children, but the last piece of his legacy. On the first morning of framing, Boone called Nadira up the hill, where the ground had been leveled, large planks stacked in rows, and men from neighboring homesteads hammered stakes, measured lines, and tied their ropes. Nadira stood in the sunlight, watching them work. A strange feeling rose in her, warm but heavy, because she understood this school was being built from a heart that no longer beat. Boone came beside her, handing her a pencil and a sheet of notes. You'll help with the inside, he said. Windows, shelves, boards. Matthew liked things to make sense. You're like him in that, Nadira answered quietly. Boone paused a moment, then simply nodded. Day after day, they worked side by side. Nadira sketched the interior. Desk placement, the bookshelves, where the map would hang. Boone stood behind her, leaning close to see her drawings, his hair brushing her temple whenever he bent forward. It was unintentional. But Nadira felt it every time. Others noticed too. They didn't say it aloud, but their looks lingered. Longer, sharper, curious. One noon, with the sun high overhead, Nadira tried to pull a thick plank from the pile. It slipped, and the edge sliced a quick line across her left hand. She recoiled. "Let me see." Boone's voice came low and fast. He took her hand, without waiting for permission, and turned it gently to examine the cut. His dark eyes dropped, weighted with genuine worry. It wasn't deep, but it stung. Boone said nothing more. He guided her away from the crowd, around the back of the half-built schoolhouse where it was quiet. Only wind and distant hammering. He opened the leather pouch at his belt, took out clean cloth and a small water flask. "You hurt yourself trying to carry too much," he said softly. "I just wanted to help," Nadira replied. "You did, but not at the cost of your own hand." He poured water over the cut. The cold sting made Nadira flinch, and Boone tightened his hold around her wrist to steady her. The space between them was close enough for Nadira to feel his breath circle her skin. As he wrapped her hand, his fingers passed through her palm, slow, careful. A light touch, but longer than necessary. Time seemed to settle around them. Nadira looked up. Boone was already watching her, his gaze deeper, warmer, softened by something he didn't say. A gust of wind rustled the dry leaves. Boone bent his head to tie the last knot of the bandage, but his eyes never drifted far from hers. "Boone," Nadira whispered, her heartbeat clear in her chest. He tightened the final knot, keeping her wrist for one more breath. "You have to be more careful," he said, his voice carrying both worry and something like affection. The moment was brief, but anyone who saw it would know there was something between them that could not stop hidden forever. When the frame was finished, the whole town gathered. Children ran about, adults brought dishes to share, the air buzzing like a small festival. The little bell, ordered by Boone from St. Louis, was the final piece to be hung. Below it, townsfolk formed a wide circle, waiting for the moment. Boone handed Nadira the bell rope. "Matthew wanted the teacher to ring it first," he said quietly. "Today, that's you." Nadira's chest tightened with emotion she couldn't name. She stepped forward and took the rope. Boone stood behind her, not touching, but close enough for his warmth to reach her back. Nadira pulled. The bell rang. The sound swept across the Holt Valley, falling over rooftops, fields, and children's footsteps. It echoed like a greeting to a new future, just as Matthew had once written. The crowd cheered. But in all the noise, Nadira heard only one thing: her own heartbeat. She turned. Boone stood among the circle of people, but his eyes searched only for her. And in that instant, Nadira understood. Circumstances might force them to keep quiet, but their feelings had already crossed every boundary. Others might sense it, but only Boone and Nadira knew what was truly unfolding. In the exact moment the first bell rang. It didn't take long for Gailsburg to do what every small western town did best: talk. At first, it was only glances and half-whispered hints. But once Matthew's school began taking shape, once Boone and Nadira spent every day measuring, planning, and working together in sunlight and sawdust, the inevitable happened. One morning at the general store, Amy Grayson, the banker's wife, placed a hand on Nadira's arm, her voice sweet enough to show the thorns beneath. "Miss Holt." "Oh, pardon me, Miss Holt," she corrected, stretching the word. "You must be pleased, having Boone look after you so much, even though Matthew hasn't been gone long." Nadira's lips tightened. We're building a school for the whole region. That's all. Yes, of course, Amy smiled, her eyes cold. It's just, people talk. You understand. Nadira didn't answer, but as she stepped out the door, she heard the whispers rise behind her. A mail-order bride who never met her husband and already tangled with his brother. Boone's a good man, but a man's heart can soften. Matthew won't rest easy in his grave. The words pricked at Nadira like needles, not enough to break her, but sharp enough to remain. That afternoon, when Boone brought the wagon to fetch her from town, Nadira was quieter than usual. He noticed immediately. What happened? He asked, rein steady but his shoulder tilting toward her. Nadira didn't want to say it, but Boone's eyes, a rare mix of hardness and concern, made her exhale. They're saying we're doing something we shouldn't, she whispered. That you're with your brother's bride. Boone stiffened. His chest rose, then fell slowly, as if forcing the anger down. I'll speak to them. His voice was low, sharp, like a blade drawn free. I'll tell them everything. No. Nadira stopped him, her hand on his arm. Not yet. Boone turned to her, his eyes darkening. You're enduring this for me, Nadira. I can't let... Boone, she cut in. If you speak now, they'll say exactly what they want to say. That we have something to hide. Boone clenched his jaw. Then what do you want me to do? Stand by while they speak of you like that? I want... time, Nadira said softly. Time until the school is settled. Until people see my work is real. Until they see what we're doing is for Matthew. Matthew, Boone repeated, the name tightening in his throat. Nadira met his eyes. I never want to be the reason anyone thinks you betrayed your brother. Silence held them for several seconds, long enough for Nadira to see the strain in Boone's grip on the reins, long enough to see him torn between defending her now and guarding Matthew's memory. At last, he spoke, voice rough. I hate waiting, but if you want it, I'll wait. A soft breath eased inside her. That evening, the air in the main house felt heavier. No one said anything aloud, but Mrs. Davis watched Nadira with knowing sympathy, and the ranch hands eyed Boone as if measuring how far his temper might go. Later, when Nadira carried a bucket of grain to the barn as usual to ready Ghost's feed, Matthew's old horse, Boone followed without her hearing him. Among the smell of hay and the warm lamplight, Boone stepped closer, his voice lower than it had been all day. Nadira. She turned. He stood too near for composure. He lifted her hand, checking the bandage from the previous day, as though using it as a reason to touch her. What they say doesn't trouble me, Boone said, eyes fixed on her hand. But hurting you, that I can't stand. Nadira opened her mouth, but Boone pressed his forehead gently to hers. It was not a kiss, but it was intimate enough that their breaths became one. I just want you to know, Boone said slowly, each word dropping deep into her chest. What they say is not the truth of us. Nadira placed her hand against his chest, over his heart. I know. They didn't kiss, but Boone leaned in and placed a light kiss on her forehead, a kiss of reassurance, of protection, of patience, of feeling deeper than words. And in that moment, among the sound of horses breathing and the warm scent of wood, Nadira knew that whatever the rumors outside, this bond was growing, quiet, strong, and steady as the land itself. 3 months had passed since the night they belonged to each other. Months long and short at once, enough for fear to settle, enough for their bond to rise from something hidden to something steady, something that endured the town's whispers, Matthew's memory, and their own hesitations. The school was running well. Every morning's bell was Matthew's legacy, yet the hands keeping it alive belonged to Boone and Nadira. People in Gailsburg still murmured, some more than others, but Nadira learned to smile and keep teaching. And Boone had a way of looking at folks that made their talk lose its edge. One late summer afternoon, when sunlight turned the tall grass the color of honey, Boone walked to Nadira's cabin and knocked once, softly. "Are you free?" His voice held no rush, but carried the weight of a decision. Nadira fastened her light shawl and stepped out. "Where are we going?" "Up the ridge," Boone said, "where Matthew used to stand when he wanted to see the whole ranch." Nadira studied his face and needed only a second to understand. This day would be different. The walk wasn't far, only a steady rise. Wind moved through the grass, lifting the hem of her dress, while Boone's hat cast a quiet shadow across his face. At the top, the land opened wide, the ranch, the creek, the fields Matthew and Boone had carved from hard soil. "Matthew came here whenever something weighed on him," Boone said. "He used to say, 'From up here, you remember what you're building.'" Nadira stayed silent. Respect for Matthew had always lived between them. Never a shadow, only a truth they both held. Boone turned to her. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a man holding distance. They were the eyes of someone who had finally reached an answer. "These 3 months," Boone said, "I've tried to live in a way that's right for Matthew, right for myself, and right for you." Nadira folded her hands at her waist, a habit when she braced for something important. "Matthew was a good man," Boone said slowly, "but he isn't here to teach the children, or build the school, or bring you home the way he hoped. And I thought I wasn't allowed to be happy. I feared people would say I took what he left behind." Nadira met his gaze. Her eyes were clear as evening light. "But you're here today," Boone continued. "Not because of Matthew, not because of a promise on paper. You're here because you chose this ranch, and you chose me." Boone reached into his coat. In his palm lay a small ring, old gold, a pale blue stone, simple and durable. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She wanted us to keep it for someone worthy. Matthew never had the chance. I want it to be yours." Wind tugged at Nadira's shawl, but she didn't move. She kept her eyes on him. Boone spoke again, voice low but steady. "Will you stand with me and keep building this life?" Nadira didn't cry. She didn't tremble. There was no gasp, no hand over her mouth. She simply took one step closer. Light, but certain. "I will," she said. One sentence, but the clearest one of her life. Boone didn't quite exhale, but his shoulders eased, as if a long-carried burden had finally found ground. He slid the ring onto her finger, the hand that had held books, tools, and hope, and the sunlight settled along their figures in a way Nadira knew she would remember for the rest of her days. Boone pulled her into his arms. Not tight, not hurried. Just the embrace of a man who had found his place to rest. Below the hill, the new school stood finished. On the ridge, 2 figures stood with their shadows touching, the land itself seeming to offer its quiet blessing. And Nadira understood. She was not only proposed to, she was chosen by a man who knew loss and therefore knew how to hold what remained. Autumn came slow that year, as if trying to keep a little more gold on the wild grass before the cold wind swept down Clay Ridge. The new school, Matthew Holt's dream made real, had already become a daily stop for the people of Gailsburg, a place where they sent their children and set their hopes on rows of pine-scented benches. And today, in that very place, a small wedding was being prepared. That morning, Nadira stood in the small room behind the classroom, the room Boone had insisted they keep for the teacher's quiet corner. Now it served as her bridal room. On the table lay a simple white veil Mrs. Davis had sewn. No lace, no elaborate stitching, just a soft layer of cloth like autumn breath. Nadira touched the veil, feeling a tremor she could not name. Not fear, not nerves, just the quiet trembling that comes when one stands at a threshold she never imagined years ago. The old mirror, made from two smaller pieces, reflected her face, the strong face of a teacher who had left Boston behind, and the face of a woman about to step into a new life with a man she had chosen with both clarity and tenderness. Outside, voices rose. Children ran past carrying wildflowers, skirts fluttering in the breeze. They looked as excited as if this wedding belonged to them too. "You ready, dear?" Mrs. Davis asked from the door. Nadira smiled. "I think I am." The older woman placed the veil over her head with warm, careful hands. "Boone will look at you like the world has narrowed down to one person," she murmured, eyes bright. When Nadira stepped into the schoolyard, the crowd fell still for a moment. No trumpets, no embroidery, no glittering gown, but there was something better. Respect. Those who had once doubted now looked at her differently. Witnesses to a love that had endured rumor, narrow views, and fear. Boone stood at the school's front door, right beneath the Holt School sign he had hung the day before. When he saw her approach, something in his eyes lifted, like a part of his losses had eased. No one spoke as she reached him. The wind's quiet breath, the soft laughter of the children, Boone's steady gaze, those were enough. Reverend Collins stood calm between them. "We gather to witness," he said, "but I believe you've all seen their journey long before this day." Boone took her hand, his rough palm closing around her smaller one. One single hold, but firm as a vow. The vows were short. No ornaments, no grand phrases, only the simplest truths. "I promise to build a life with you the way I've built this ranch, with my hands, with my strength, and with an honest heart. I promise to stand with you in the classroom and on the fields, in the easy days and the hard ones." When the Reverend said, "I declare you husband and wife," Nadira felt the prairie wind move through her, a slow, deep breath of freedom and belonging. Boone kissed her, a soft, steady kiss, marking a new chapter rather than trying to impress a crowd. The small celebration unfolded right there in the yard. Bread, beef, stewed apples, and dishes neighbors brought. Laughter everywhere. Children circling the newlyweds like small birds. Boone stayed close to Nadira, his hand brushing hers now and then, or resting on her back. Nothing showy, just enough to make both feel whole. When the valley fell into golden light, Boone led her to the wagon decorated with wildflowers. People moved aside without needing to be asked. Boone bent down, slipping an arm under her knees and another behind her back. "What are you doing?" She laughed. "Tradition," he said. "A new life should start the right way." He lifted her into the wagon with ease, so gently she felt she had belonged in his arms long before this day. On the ride back to Holt Ranch, the wind tugged at her veil, and Nadira rested her head on Boone's shoulder, watching the sun settle behind the land. In that moment, she was no longer a mail-order bride, not a stranger from Boston. She was Boone Holt's wife, part of this land, and a new life had begun. The first years after the wedding passed as quietly as the warm winds that drifted through the Holt Ranch valley. No shouting, no storms, only busy days woven together by the whinny of horses, the thud of hammers on fence posts, children's laughter, and the morning chime of the new school bell. After their first winter together, change came to them in the gentlest way. Nadira was expecting. Boone froze when Mrs. Davis told him. He only placed a hand on Nadira's back, lightly, as if he feared hurting her, yet in his eyes was something he had never shown before. Gratitude, a joy too deep to turn into sound. That spring, when the prairie softened into pale green, their first child arrived, a girl. Boone held her carefully, his rough hand supporting her tiny face. He stared at her so long, Mrs. Davis finally told him to sit before his knees gave out. "She has your eyes," Nadira whispered. Boone shook his head, though a rare warm curve appeared at the corner of his mouth. "No, she has yours. Gentle, but able to see straight through a person." They named her Grace Holt. The years that followed reshaped Holt Ranch one season at a time. Boone expanded the horse herd, built new barns, and drew fresh water lines from the northern valley. Nadira continued teaching at Holt School, her class growing by the month. Children from homesteads half a day away still rode in for Miss Nadira, the teacher who taught more than letters. She taught them that they could grow beyond the limits their parents had once known. When Grace turned 2, Nadira bore their second child, a quiet boy, rarely fussy and hardly ever crying. Boone lifted his son, kissed his forehead, and said only one sentence. "This one, he looks like Matthew." Nadira watched Boone for a long moment, knowing those words held a softened grief that had never appeared. They named the boy Jacob. Time moved like a steady stream, neither rushing nor drying out, simply flowing, nourishing everything in its path. Nadira's days found their rhythm, teaching in the morning, helping Boone with accounts in the afternoon, and rocking the children to sleep on the wooden bed Boone had built with his own hands. Every night, when the wind carried the scent of dry grass into their room, Boone laid a hand on her waist, not gripping, only resting there, like a man who knew he had finally found where to lean after a long day. Now and then Gailsburg still whispered a rumor or two, but they passed like wind at the window, too faint to shake anything inside their home. And the coming years brought more new things. A parcel of land purchased to the east, a crop of calves born in spring, a willow tree planted near the school, and a third child. A girl whose laughter chimed like a small bell. Together, these pieces became a life. One evening, when sunset spilled honey-colored light over the fields, Nadira stood on the porch holding the baby. Grace and Jacob chased each other in the yard, feet kicking through brittle summer grass. Boone was closing the west gate, hammering in the last of a new fence. Watching them, Nadira felt her heart go still. Not from pain, not from weariness, but from the quiet wonder of realizing that the life once broken, wandering, and lost had somehow become full. Boone climbed the steps. He placed his warm hand at the back of her neck, the gesture he used whenever he wanted to say something without speaking. "Was class all right today?" Nadira leaned into his shoulder. "Good. The kids are getting smarter every week." "That's because they have a good teacher," Boone said. voice low, almost smiling. She didn't reply. She simply rested her head against his chest. The warmth that had once been strange to her now felt more like home than any house she'd ever lived in. After a long while, Nadira said softly, "Boone, do you ever think, if 3 years ago, things had gone differently?" He covered her back with his hand. "No. I don't think about what didn't happen. I think about what's here." Nadira looked out at the field, the sun lowering into the land. Then she whispered, clear as truth, "I feel the same. I know I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Boone pulled her closer. The children laughed in the yard. The wind brushed the tall grass like a quiet affirmation. And the sentence, one both of them felt, though only one spoke, settled into the warm space between them. All the pain led us to the place we truly belong. On Holt Ranch, that sentence was more than true. It was gratitude for every road they had taken to reach this one. If this story warmed your heart even a little, feel free to leave a comment. Maybe a memory, a person you miss, or simply the feeling of hearing wind at the porch. And if you'd like to keep traveling through gentle Wild West love stories like this one, I invite you to like and subscribe. Who knows, you might find a piece of your own past in the stories still to come.